a series of wars between the Muslims and the Christians. However, the Muslims referred to this violence as the Frankish invasions because crusade was a Christian word. Crusaders were marked with the cross because they believed that would protect them. You could say Jerusalem was the hot guy at school who all the girls fought over. Jerusalem was located in the Middle East as a crossroad for trade. The Christians and the Muslims wanted to control Jerusalem so they could make money. Pope Urban II described the Muslims as savages who destroyed churches and made them mosques. The Pope has to describe them this way because he had to make people fight. You had to hate the people to kill them. Lastly, the Crusades provided no military gain and ultimately just pushes Europe out of the medieval times. Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, was the most devastating natural disaster in European history. It originated in Asia and made its way to Europe in 1347 through rats and fleas. Within 3 to 7 days of exposure to plague bacteria, you will develop flu-like symptoms such as fever, headache, chills, weakness, and swollen tender lymph glands called buboes, hence the name bubonic plague. Mortality reached 50 to 60% in some areas and nearly wiped out between 25 and 50% of European population. Many could not understand why such misfortune was happening in Europe. Many began to believe it was punishment from God. The death of Dante marks the end of the Middle Ages. Dante's Divine Comedy describes heaven, hell, and purgatory. He believed hell was cold because it was the farthest thing from God, who is warm. Dante's Inferno was part of the Divine Comedy. It was written in the Middle Ages but was more Renaissance. More Renaissance because 1. He takes heaven and hell and forms his own ideas about them, and 2. Because Dante's man is Virgil, an ancient Roman poet, and since he is Roman and not a pope nor Christian, he proves to be more Renaissance. Humanism is an idea that changes how people think in Europe and starts the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period when Western Europeans experienced a deep cultural awakening. It signaled the beginning of modern times. Educated Europeans developed new attitudes about themselves and the world. It first began in city-states of Italy because Italians were closest to legacy of ancient Roman culture. Humanism is a movement that focused on the value and worth of each individual based on the ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. Focused on secular worldly themes instead of religious ideas and the afterlife. Humanists were scholars who promoted humanism and wanted to use the classical beliefs of Rome and Greece to renew society. Individualism was an emphasis on the dignity and worth of the individual person. Individualism was an important concept that humanists introduced. Humanists focused on human improvement and developing individual talents through politics, sports, and arts. Humanism inspired new forms of literature written in vernacular, regional languages specific to one area like French, Spanish, and Italian. Writings focused on personal feelings and ambition.
Essentially, the Renaissance was an efflorescence of arts, primarily visual, but also to a lesser extent literary, and ideas in Europe that coincided with the rediscovery of Roman and Greek culture. It's easiest to see this in terms of visual art. Renaissance art tends to feature a focus on the human form, somewhat idealized, as Roman and especially Greek art had. And this classicizing is also rather apparent in the architecture of the Renaissance, which featured all sorts of Greek columns and triangular pediments and Roman arches and domes. In fact, looking at a Renaissance building, you might even be able to fool yourself into thinking you're looking at an actual Greek building if you sort of squint and ignore the fact that Greek buildings tend to be, ruins.
Machiavelli had many different sides to him. He went from being an important diplomat to a general, and ultimately to an enemy of the state. Machiavelli is also famous for writing The Prince, which is known for its sinister undertone. Every dictator worships this book because it speaks the truth. We all live our lives and know how we should act, but we don't act that way in reality. It's not titled until Machiavelli dies because it was never meant to be a book. It was only meant to be given to a man named Lorenzo so he could find a job. Machiavelli also turned to the question whether it would be better to be feared or to be loved as a leader. While he wrote it would theoretically be wonderful for a leader to be both feared and loved, a prince should always err on the side of terror because it is ultimately what keeps people in check.
Lucia Giovanni, Geoffrey and Cesare, Italian Barbiani, the Borgia family. Our daddy was Rodrigo. I had a monstrous ego. When he makes trouble we go, the Borgia family. Our tale begins when Nathan Spain in Sweden for a shower, and I ran out of patience, so began my quest for power. I splashed my cash to all the papal cardinals in hope that they'd be bought. They were in short, and I became the Pope. More power than iota, blood sticker and mortar. Appoint my sons and daughter to run a dynasty. With daddy as the pope, I could do as I pleased, was ace. I'd kill a man who dared to invade my personal space. I found a husband for Lucretia, rich Giovanni Sforza. Do you love him?
Yes, of course, but love is power and money more so.
Now married to the Sforzas, this opens up new doors. The world bows down before us, the Borgia Sforza family. Oh yes, and while we're at it, we will marry son Geoffrey. Age 12, but so on soon will be the Borgia Sforza and the Naples family. When the Sforza family eventually bores you, we'll just annul the marriage if he refuses to divorce you.
Don't I get to say?
Don't fret for you, another man I'll get. Alfonso of Aragon.
I like him. This could go on and on.
You like him? I've gone off him. His pretty face makes me wince.
You killed him?
Yeah, I'm the model for Machiavelli's prince. Giovanni ran the army, but Cesare said, no way, I'll kill you if you cross me, I might kill you anyway. I am the mostest powerfulest, evilest of all. As long as Dad's alive, there's not a single chance I'll fall. Oh no. With suddenly of status, it seems the whole world hates us. They excommunicate us, the Borgia family.
When it came to the Reformation, Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, because Erasmus already did everything that Luther did, but he never wanted to separate from the Roman Catholic Church. Thomas More was born in England. He was an educated man that worked for Henry VIII. More wanted a utopia. He says that a perfect society should have cooperation, a replacement for power and fame, no property ownership. Most land is owned by the Roman Catholic Church. He is making slight at the Roman Catholic Church, at the Pope, by saying this. When justifying for his involvement with Henry VIII, he stated, "What you can't make right, you must try to make as little wrong as possible. If you can't change Henry VIII, make it a little less wrong. He just wants to get rid of indulgences." There are problems in the church with Pope Alexander VI. He bought the papacy and was the father of Borgia. He has kids, which is a problem since he's a pope. He wants to allow people to get married so they don't have to be celibate. Upward mobility. In the Roman Catholic Church, you could be a peasant and become a pope later on, but by the 1500s, nobility and the bourgeoisie were the only people in power. You're supposed to have piety not because your dad bought it. Pluralism is holding more than one office. The problem is you're holding both positions, you can't focus on one, so they hire an incompetent person who doesn't care about their job. Hobbes believes he was born in fear because when his mother was carrying him, the Spanish Armada was going to take over England. His mother was so stressed that she had a premature birth. Hobbes lived through the beheading of Charles V. Hobbes believes that man is evil, therefore he writes the Leviathan. He is not religious but uses the biblical beast because people at the time were religious and could relate. Hobbes' government needs to be as powerful as the Leviathan. Hobbes believes that man is equal in fear and danger. The social contract is between the people and themselves. The government's role is to provide safety. No one has rights. People put all their faith in government to protect them, which is an example of absolutism. Hobbes believes that the natural rights were life, liberty, and property, but you can give up your rights. Hobbes was in favor of absolutism because 1. Everyone believes in the divine right of kings. 2. Kings should rule because of their education. And 3. It's consistent for people in Europe. Hobbes said that religion can cause a civil war. The government should control religion because the king can't control the religion and the church. Locke lives through the Glorious Revolution. He is called the reluctant Democrat because he believes the government serves to make sure people's rights are there. Locke agrees with Hobbes that life is brutal. Locke believes that the social contract is between the people and the king. If we do not agree with the government, we have the right to revolt. It does not have to be bloody, it could simply be a new election. Life, liberty, and property, but property is the most important. Land equals power. Most of the population does not have land. Locke also believes you should not have the right to vote if you do not own land, because if you pay taxes, you know how the legislation of the government works. There was great hostility in Europe with Elizabeth I, because when Mary dies, Philip wants to rule and gets help from Mary Queen of Scots. Elizabeth orders Mary Queen of Scots to be beheaded. She purposely orders the axeman to not sharpen the axe. It took him 3 tries to kill her. Elizabeth also has to deal with Philip and the Spanish Armada, who is the strongest navy. Elizabeth makes a speech, there is a full army, and wins over her men by saying they will meet in heaven or play in the fields of victory, but they do defeat the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth also refuses to marry because she does not want to share the power. She has balanced polity with Parliament, which is a monarch and government work together. Parliament wants her to get married, which creates a rift in the relationship because she refuses to. The Gunpowder Plot. There's a guy named Guy Fawkes, or John Johnson, and converts to Catholicism from Anglicanism. He wants to kill everyone that is not Catholic. So 13 people get together and they decide that they're going to blow up Parliament. They decide that they're going to interview for Parliament and demand that they work in the basement. They work in the basement and bring barrels of gunpowder in over a week. One of the men gets cold feet and tells a Parliament member the plan and to not go to Parliament on November 5th, 1605. The member at first disregards it, but then decides to tell the king. The two go to the basement and see Guy Fawkes about to light the gunpowder. They take Guy Fawkes and torture him, and he tells them all the information they want to hear. They draw and quarter the rest of the men except for Guy Fawkes. They want to hang and burn him, but he commits suicide before that happens. Today, on November 5th, they have Guy Fawkes Day. Descartes. Doubt everything until you can logically prove it. I can logically prove I exist. I think, therefore I am. We can logically prove that God exists. Kant. Logic and reason are supreme. We can logically prove what is right and wrong. It is irrational to act in an immoral way. Logically, God must exist. John Locke. Conflict arises when people try to enforce their religious views on others. Therefore, logically, religious tolerance will make society more peaceful. French Enlightenment. Discussions in the salons in Paris. Salons discussed how society should be organized logically. Voltaire. Society should be based upon reason rather than faith. Believe France should have a similar constitutional monarchy like Britain has had ever since the Glorious Revolution. Montesquieu. The separation of the powers. The government, who run the country, should be separate from the legislature. Parliament, the ones who make the laws. Judges, they should enforce the laws. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement in the 17th and 18th centuries to use logic and reason to decide how a country should be organized. influenced by the French Revolution. John Locke lived through the reign of James II and the Glorious Revolution. People can live peacefully together once they use reason to work out and understand God. John Locke. There are natural rights all people have, the right to life, liberty, and the ownership of property. The task of the government is to protect these rights. The storming of the Bastille goes along with the start of the French Revolution on July 14, 1789. The Bastille has a reputation of a medieval torture jail. The goal of storming the Bastille was to get guns and munitions, but they ended up freeing the 7 prisoners there and then beheading the innocent warden that they chased to the roof where he waves a white flag and surrenders, but they chop off his head anyway. This is where beheading begins in the French Revolution. They take the key to the Bastille and they give it to George Washington because they want his help fighting, but he refuses because he does not want to be involved in foreign wars. Now France and America have a weird relationship because France funded the American Revolution, but now America will not help France. The French only helped us to piss off the Britain. The great fear is when peasants fear nobles will come and collect their debts, but none of this is true. Because of this, the peasants burn everything symbolizing their debts. This is stupid because there are 2 copies of everything, but their burning the documents buys them some time. The peasants take the parish priests and throw them off boats. The peasants kill cows and say they're French soldiers. Contaminated grains makes them a little loopy. The September massacres is a domestic crisis in 1792 that kills 1,600 people in just days. The prisons are raided because they're counter-revolutionaries. We need to kill them because we can't have them team up with Austria or Prussia. This is the first instance we see what happens when the common man takes control of the revolution. Robespierre is the head of the Committee of Public Safety. His mom dies when he is 6 years old, and his father leaves him, so he lives with his aunt and uncle who make him feel like a burden. And the only way he's going to get out of the house if he does well in school. He is very intelligent and eventually goes on to law school. They call Robespierre the Incorruptible because he is consistent with his beliefs. He likes morality and reason. He does not like the death penalty, but, unusually, he does end up becoming corrupted. He's now the biggest proponent of the guillotine because he claims that things change. Danton is an everyday man. When he spoke, people listened because he gave amazing speeches and knew how to appeal to the common man. Marat can also be known as the bathtub guy. Beginning of the revolution, guards are looking for him and they find him in a sewer where he caught a skin disease, so he's always soaking in some bathtub. Marat failed at most things, but he did have a successful propaganda newspaper. Robespierre would come up with the ideas and Marat would publicize it. A woman named Charlotte Corday believes the only way the terror dies is if Marat dies. She kills him with a knife in the bathtub and is ultimately beheaded. Robespierre uses Marat as a martyr. He has a David painting of Marat in the bathtub that looks very similar to the Pietà, and he also has people worship this bathtub.
A powerful figure emerged to take charge of France. But did he save the revolution or destroy it?
Order, order. Who's a defendant today? I don't see anyone.
Your Honor, this is Napoleon Bonaparte, the tyrant who invaded nearly all of Europe to compensate for his personal, stature-based insecurities. Actually, Napoleon was at least average height for his time. The idea that he was short comes only from British wartime propaganda. And he was no tyrant. He was safeguarding the young republic from being crushed by the European monarchies, by overthrowing its government and seizing power himself. Your Honor, as a young and successful military officer, Napoleon fully supported the French Revolution and its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the revolutionaries were incapable of real leadership. Robespierre and the Jacobins who first came to power unleashed a reign of terror on the population, with their anti-Catholic extremism and non-stop executions of everyone who disagreed with them. And the Directory that replaced them was an unstable and incompetent oligarchy. They needed a strong leader who could govern wisely and justly.
So, France went through that whole revolution just to end up with another all-powerful ruler?
Not quite. Napoleon's new powers were derived from the Constitution, that was approved by a popular vote in the consulate. Ha! The Constitution was practically dictated at gunpoint in a military coup, and the public only accepted the tyrant because they were tired of constant civil war. Be that as it may, Napoleon introduced a new constitution and a legal code that kept some of the most important achievements of the Revolution intact: freedom of religion, abolition of hereditary privilege, and equality before the law for all men. All men, indeed. He deprived women of the rights that the Revolution had given them, and even reinstated slavery in the French colonies. Haiti is still recovering from the consequences centuries later. What kind of equality is that? The only kind that could be stably maintained at the time, and still far ahead of France's neighbors.
Speaking of neighbors, what was with all the invasions?
Great question, Your Honor. Which invasions are we talking about? It was the neighboring empires who had invaded France, trying to restore the monarchy and prevent the spread of liberty across Europe, twice by the time Napoleon took charge. Having defended France as a soldier and a general in those wars, he knew that the best defense is a good offense. An offense against the entire continent? Peace was secured by 1802, and other European powers recognized the new French regime. But Bonaparte couldn't rest unless he had control of the whole continent, and all he knew was fighting. He tried to enforce a European-wide blockade of Britain, invaded any country that didn't comply, and launched more wars to hold on to his gains. And what was the result? Millions dead all over the continent, and the whole international order shattered. You forgot the other result: the spread of democratic and liberal ideals across Europe. It was thanks to Napoleon that the continent was reshaped from a chaotic patchwork of fragmented feudal and religious territories into efficient, modern, and secular nation-states, where the people held more power and rights than ever before. Should we also thank him for the rise of nationalism and the massive increase in army sizes? You can see how well that turned out a century later.
So what would European history have been like if it weren't for Napoleon?
Unimaginably better. Napoleon's seemingly unstoppable momentum would die in the Russian winter snows, along with most of his army. But even after being deposed and exiled, he refused to give up, escaping from his prison and launching a bold attempt at restoring his empire, before being defeated for the second and final time. Bonaparte was a ruler full of contradictions, defending a popular revolution by imposing absolute dictatorship, and spreading liberal ideals through imperial wars. And though he never achieved his dream of conquering Europe, he undoubtedly left his mark on it, for better or for worse.
The Congress of Vienna is meant to establish policies and alliances, but there are positives and negatives. Some of the positives were: 1, it stabilized France; 2, there was no war for about 100 years, but really there was just no war between the European powers. Some of the negatives were: 1, repressive governments; 2, caused World War II; 3, brought back all the monarchs. They do not use the term absolutism because they want to create an illusion. They use the term conservatism or legitimacy. The key players at the Congress of Vienna were Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, Spain, and eventually France. Metternich was the Austrian prince, also known as the host. King Frederick William III was with Prussia. Tsar Alexander I was the Emperor of Russia. And Castlereagh was the Foreign Minister of Great Britain. Lastly, Maurice de Talleyrand, the Foreign Minister of France. The Concert of Europe. This was a series of alliances developed by Metternich. These alliances assured that the nations would support each other if any revolutions broke out. This helped unite the nations whether they wanted it or not. In the Chapelle Protocol, they decide that they have the right to intervene with army rebellion, but Britain says no to this because they only agree on intervening with France. Latin America is controlled by the Spanish and Portuguese. Bolivar, the George Washington of Latin America, and Martin led these rebellions. Spanish and Portuguese asked the Concert of Europe for help, but the British say no because they want to open up trade if they fail. This plan is squashed by the Monroe Doctrine, and the U.S. is the one that intervenes. The U.S. should have used British ships because no European power wanted to challenge the British. Marie Curie gets the Nobel Prize for Chemistry and Physics. She's the first person ever to do this. Also, she's the first mother-daughter team to win the prize. Before Curie, the atom was believed to be a solid hard mass, but she proves that the atom is not that and consists of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Sigmund Freud came up with 3 phases that describe childhood behavior. The first phase is the oral phase, or food. How your parents feed you changed your life. If you were poor, it was one way. If you were a reward, it was another, or comfort. It depended on how food was to you. Number 2 is the anal phase. It's how your parents potty trained you. If they were nice or they were evil about it, children see their body as a form of control. And number 3 was the phallic phase, which also means sexual desires, or the Oedipus complex. Children will learn to love the way their opposite parent taught them. Nietzsche came up with the Übermensch, which meant the best human being that could possibly be. The characteristics of this Übermensch was 1. Violence is fine if it was for the greater good. 2. The leader has to make his own path. 3. Views of Christianity as a pact. 4. Sex is a part of life. 5. Must accept some loneliness because no one will understand him. Herbert Spencer takes Darwin's ideas and says that man has Darwinism in them. In an industrial society, the rich people have adapted. Factory owners have adapted to society because he is rich, but the poor worker has not adapted. World War I was also called the Great War because 1. The entire world was affected. 2. The amount of men that fought. Russia had 6 million soldiers, and India lost at least 1 million men. 3. The amount of men that died. About 15 million died. Germany had the most dead. 4. No war like this ever existed. We were never the same after this war. 15-year-old boys were fighting. The main causes of World War I were M. Militarism, A. Alliances, I. Imperialism, and N. Nationalism.
Take the high road like I should. You said it's meant to be, that it's not you, it's me. You're living now for my own good. That's cool, but if my friends ask where you are, I'm gonna say she went down in an airplane, fried getting sun.
After 4 years of fighting in World War I, millions had lost their lives and the world was forever changed. Hi, I'm Rebecca Brayton and welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be taking a look at the aftermath of the First World War. Undeniably, the greatest consequence of the First World War was the massive loss of life. France had lost nearly 1.4 million soldiers and an additional 300,000 civilians in the war. More than 1.8 million Russian soldiers were killed, as well as 1.5 million civilians. In total, World War I was responsible for the deaths of over 16 million people. However, numbers relating to the death toll are still debated. Considered separate but still related to World War I was the effect the flu pandemic of 1918 had on the world. First seen in North America, it is suspected the flu was brought to Europe by the American forces. This flu was ultimately responsible for the deaths of nearly 50 million people worldwide. Many countries on both sides felt the severe economic consequences of waging a world war. The United Kingdom went from one of the world's largest overseas investors to one of its biggest debtors. Less concrete changes for Britain were also apparent. There was a surge in national pride among some of the Commonwealth nations. Countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand held important roles in numerous battles throughout the war. Subsequently, they received more diplomatic autonomy in the decade that followed. Returning home from the battlefields, soldiers across the world were greeted with a shifting social landscape. Women had filled the gap in jobs left by the men serving in the war. Motivated to help their country, many women worked distributing coal or making ammunition, and also provided a large amount of voluntary work. These new roles helped to change the social status and working lives of women even after World War I had ended. Political lines were redrawn in the aftermath of the war. Once powerful German, Russian, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian empires were dissolved, with the latter two ceasing to exist altogether. Large parts of the former empires were now split up into new countries like Finland, Turkey, and Czechoslovakia. Most importantly for the future of Europe and the world was what was happening in Germany. A parliamentary system called the Weimar Republic replaced the imperial form of government in 1919. However, the new government was riddled with issues. They were forced to deal with hyperinflation, hostility from other countries, and political extremists within their own country. Many in Germany were still resentful over the Treaty of Versailles, which had forced the country to accept sole responsibility in causing the First World War. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party used these strong emotions to their advantage, and Hitler climbed to the position of Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Very quickly, Hitler established a totalitarian regime called the Third Reich, and put an end to the Weimar Republic after only 14 years. Only 20 years after the end of World War I, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and the century's Second World War was underway.
Five years ago, in 2010, Greece began to face financial trouble that, unknown at the time, would be ongoing 5 years later. Simply, Greece's economy was spending more money than they had to spend, therefore leaving them in debt that would begin to grow as the years passed. Worried that their financial troubles would spread to neighboring European countries, Germany, the powerhouse of Europe with the strongest economy, decided to lend Greece money in time of crisis. Germany has bailed out Greece 3 times since 2010 when they first agreed to come to assistance. However, Germany's interest was not to save Greece from total disaster. Germany was worried that their country, as well as others, were in danger due to the issues in Greece. The refugee crisis in Europe has arguably hit Greece the hardest. The country has enough to deal with concerning their financial crisis, leaving them no time to handle the thousands of refugees pouring into Lesbos. The Lesbos mayor, Gailano Cyprus, states, "The flood of migrants burst suddenly, no one was prepared. Not us, not Europe." Instead of asking the European Union for help with the financial crisis, Greece is now begging that they control the number of refugees that come into their country. In an attempt to do so, the European Union has done several background checks on the refugees and has also made the border more secure to help limit the number of people coming in. In the middle of the winter, the refugees' numbers had slightly declined, but there were still many making the journey. In Lesbos alone, January of last year saw around 750 people land in the island. This January, 25,000 have arrived on the island. The refugee crisis has become a substantial problem when it comes to financial crisis because they are unable to effectively focus on both at the same time. Eurasia Group President Ian Bremmer wrote, "When the refugee crisis of the Greek financial crisis collide with domestic and EU politics, we'll be right back in the soup." Recently, Turkey and the European Union made a deal to try to limit the flow of refugees into Europe. The plan states that Turkey would get €3 billion in aid from European Union towards the care of roughly 2.5 million Syrian migrants already in Turkey. The hope is that Greece can make a deal like this with the European Union if they can moderate the amount of people coming into their country. The country's government is again having trouble appeasing its creditors, who are not only pushing for more pension reform, but also protesting the fact that they'll be worse off economically if the refugee crisis continues to worsen. Although it may seem unfair, the European Union is putting more and more blame on Greece for the refugee crisis due to their inability to moderate the people coming into their country. Even though Greece has been giving warning regarding their efforts to help with the financial problems, it still seems unfair that they are given such a difficult task to handle. It seems very unlikely that Greece will be able to moderate the refugee crisis in the little time they are given to do so. Alex Tsipras, the Prime Minister of Greece, does not appreciate the way the European Union is treating Greece.